Okay, I think we can get started. And first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody to our program entitled Hidden Costs, Rethinking Lawyers and Social Drinking. We're excited to have you join us for today's webinar presented by Dr. Jeff Fortgang. My name is Amy Levine, the Director of Programs and Volunteers at Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. I will be your host today, and I will introduce Jeff momentarily. I want to remind everyone what Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers does. We offer one-on-one consultations with licensed clinicians on mental health and substance use disorders. Additionally, we provide educational programs, support groups, well-being programs, and one-on-one consultations on law practice management for the Massachusetts legal community. And as a reminder, our services are confidential and free. One housekeeping tip: we do love and encourage questions, so those will be answered after Dr. Fortgang finishes his presentation. Please use either the chat or the Q&A functions, and we'll do our best to get to everyone's questions. And now I am honored to introduce Dr. Jeff Fortgang. Jeff is a clinical psychologist and a licensed alcohol and drug counselor who joined LCL in 1998. He works part-time with LCL and maintains a private practice as well. He regularly sees clients on a one-on-one basis, runs our solo stress connection and immigration lawyer support groups, writes articles, and does presentations for the legal community. After receiving his undergraduate degree from Yale University, he worked for a few years as a musician, songwriter, and then completed his PhD in clinical psychology. He then worked for a number of inpatient and outpatient hospitals and is a former instructor in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. And finally, he is the co-author of the book, The Full Weight of the Law: How Legal Professionals Can Recognize and Rebound from Depression. He co-authored that with another LCL clinical psychologist, Dr. Sean Healy. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fortgang.
Thank you. Do you see and hear me?
Yes,
okay.
I do indeed.
So thanks a lot. I'm glad to be able to talk to you. And this is these are some slides I've put together newly for this presentation. So we'll be in some ways experiencing them together. But the subject is, I've spent a lot of my career working with individuals who are asking, do I have to stop drinking? Which has usually been a version of, do I have alcohol use disorder, or what commonly is known as alcoholism? But there's another question that has become more prominent in recent years, which is, if I don't have alcohol use disorder, might I still want to either stop or reduce drinking? So that's sort of the backdrop to this presentation. Now I will attempt to share my screen. And things happening where the Zoom bar gets in the way. Slideshow from beginning. Okay. So here we go. Rethinking lawyers and social drinking. So the first thing is, you may be aware that there have been some recent survey studies about lawyers and a number of problems, but today we're talking about alcohol, which in the general population, we see alcohol use disorder in 6%, or in some cases as high as 10%, depending on the source. In lawyers, in a 2016 study, I believe, but by the ABA and the Hazelden Foundation, they found a 21% prevalence. And in a study done more recently for Massachusetts lawyers, the prevalence reported was 42%. Part of this difference is how you define alcohol problem. And in these studies, the second two studies, they defined it by the amount and frequency of drinks and not actually all of the diagnostic criteria. Still, across many, many, many studies, lawyers always show up as having at least twice the incidence of alcohol problems compared to the general population. So that's why it's an issue for us. And our American society has always had an ambivalent attitude about alcohol, where we treat it as it's cool that people drink. We laugh approvingly when it seems to mean good times, or let's shed restrictions, or let's have camaraderie, or even let's try not to think about something. So on the left of your screen, you see Stephen Colbert. I'm a big fan of his, but I'm not wild about how he stocks a bar behind his desk and equates drinking with good times or with as a reasonable response to political goings on. And then some of the others you see there, some of the older viewers might remember Dean Martin and someone on his show who's named Foster Brooks, where heavy drinking was a big joke. Then we see Lindsay Lohan, who was a big star. Everybody loved her. Then she developed alcohol use disorder, and she was being judged. So, and similar things with Ben Affleck. Then you've got people like George Clooney, who this must be a really cool thing to do if George is doing it, etc. And Kevin Hart, who's always happy to promote addictive behaviors. Currently, we see him a lot on the gambling commercials. So we tend to, when someone is just drinking, we think it's cool. When they develop a disorder and it gets out of hand and they do something that is shameful or they die young, then we judge it. So why do people drink? Well, this is not an exhaustive list, but when they drink, they feel a little less worried. They have fewer second thoughts. They have reduced awareness of what could go wrong, and lawyers are always thinking about what could go wrong. And they feel more spontaneous, but of course, with more spontaneity comes greater risk. A lot of people drink for self-medication. For example, if they're depressed, anxious, or in pain. And one of the things about all addictive substances is that they work, and they work fast. And in the short run, that is rewarding. When it comes to depression, for example, the person will feel less aware of their depression if they drink, although over the long term, drinking will actually exacerbate depression. Then there's escapism. I want to forget about what's going on. And also, I'm rewarding myself and turning off the workday. So I've spoken with many lawyers who are beginning to see problems with their drinking, who work very hard during the day, work long hours. And when they come home, having a drink is like, I deserve this. And it's also a symbol that I'm no longer at work and I've punctuated the workday. People also drink for a sense of inclusion with others, both in terms of peer pressure and also communal feeling, like I'm one of this group of people. And in addition to all that, once you drink in a certain setting or situation repeatedly, it becomes a conditioned response. And without even thinking about it, you're more likely to continue drinking. So I looked a little bit into the history of drinking, which is something I had never really studied. And it turns out even before they were humans, they think that primates were finding and eating fermenting fruit. and no doubt found it rewarding. And when you want to develop an addictive substance, one of the features you want it to have is that it works fast and in a way that is palpable. Turns out there's evidence that there was a brewery in Israel around 11,000 BC, or BCE, if you prefer. There are some jars found in China suggesting that there was drinking in 7,000 BC. There was wine production in Georgia, 6,000. In Egypt, evidence of alcohol in pre-Hispanic Mexico. And even in the Torah, which would be the Old Testament, there's this passage, let beer be for those who are perishing, meaning it's a way to reduce pain for those who are about to die. Wine for those who are in anguish, meaning self-medication for anxiety and depression. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more. So this goes back a very long way. And the statement at the bottom is from me. If alcohol had been invented in the 20th century, it would probably be illegal or limited to prescription because it's a powerful drug with many potential dangers. But of course, that is not the case, and it's totally embedded in our society. And there are pluses to the experience. That's why people drink. So who gravitates more toward drinking? Well, the more that it feels rewarding or reinforcing, including for escaping withdrawal symptoms in the morning, hangover or tremulousness, etc., the more likely that a person is going to be to drink. You do it because it improves how you feel, and that is not equal among all people. So how great or bad it feels to drink is seems to be primarily hereditary. And people who are in more stressful environments, of course, have more incentive. It becomes more rewarding to drink because of the difference between how it feels before and after. And then people who are in a social circle or profession that embraces drinking, thinks it's cool, are more likely to do it and to join in. So lawyer culture is one of the professional cultures in which historically drinking has been embraced. And others include journalism, restaurants, construction business, music business. And lawyers typically make alcohol very available at law firm functions in the process of attracting desired associates to celebrate or commiserate after the end of a big case, and for relief from the tensions of law school. Symptoms. Now I want to talk about alcohol use disorder. Right? So most of the people that this discussion applies to don't have alcohol use disorder. Something under 20% of lawyers have developed it. And of course, if this were Americans in general, it would be something under 10%. But this is part of the diagnosis, is that you have features like inability to consistently regulate the amount consumed, which is not a matter of willpower, it's a biological feature. Typically, you've seen in a person with this disorder unsuccessful efforts to cut down and to stay cut down. You see time and mental energy shifting over to obtaining, using, or recovering from alcohol, and away from other activities and responsibilities which decline over time. And a big one, and the one that's not taken into account in those surveys I mentioned earlier, is that the person experiences a range of negative consequences of drinking, and yet continues to use. So that points up the fact that it is not regular rational behavior. Because when we're engaged in regular rational behavior and we find that something keeps creating negative consequences, we generally don't keep doing it. And the consequences can be legal, physical, relational, psychological, such as that it puts us in a worse mood over time, or risky behavior. Um, Often people with alcohol use disorder develop a high tolerance. Sometimes they're proud of how much they can hold without seeming drunk, but actually that's a warning sign of at least a potential problem. And probably a minority of people with alcohol use disorders develop what are termed withdrawal symptoms, which typically begin with tremors, sometimes sweats, waking up drenched in sweat, can progress for some people over time who drink heavily into features including seizures and even DTs, which is an uncommon thing nowadays. It's more than tremors. It includes your body temperature going way up and typically hallucinations. So, but if you don't have to stop drinking, what are some of the reasons why you might want to stop or reduce drinking? And this is part of what's now been termed the sober curious movement. And there's a book by that name, which is interesting. So even if you don't have alcohol use disorder, you may find that that if you drink less or don't drink, you'll have fewer days of not firing on all cylinders. There will be a lower chance of accidents and injuries. Of course, people's coordination is worse when they drink and they're not as observant, and it's common to have accidents or injuries. The chances are much greater under the influence. If you're not drinking or drinking relatively little, there's a lower chance of impulsive behavior, of doing things or saying things that you regret, and of making bad decisions. And those who've worked at law firms typically are aware of times where staff members have become socially or sexually inappropriate with others at the annual Christmas party or other such occasions, and in ways that they certainly regret later, and that would not have occurred if they were not under the influence. If you're drinking not at all or very little, you're not dealing with hangovers or blackouts. Most of you probably know that blackouts are not passing out. They are situations in which you're behaving in a way that you later don't remember. Because the memories when your blood alcohol level is at a certain point are just not being recorded. Again, less drinking would be associated with better long-term cognitive functioning. So this is not just about how are you functioning cognitively while you're under the influence, but drinking frequently is also associated and it's dose dependent. So it's truer the more you drink with reduced efficiency of cognitive functioning, more impairment of memory and executive function, et cetera. And in studies of people with alcohol use disorder, a return to normal cognitive functioning typically can take about a year. After about a year, people are as good as they're going to get and usually close to where they once were. If you're not drinking, or if you're drinking very little, You're going to get better sleep. That means you're going to have more energy. You will also save money. Alcohol costs money. We used to joke in the field years ago about patients who complained about the cost of coming to therapy or counseling, recognizing that they were spending much more money than that on their drinking. And now we know that the less you drink, the more likely you are to have a longer life with less organ damage. And that's part of what we're going to talk about in subsequent slides. So move the Zoom bar so I can read what I wrote. How can even low dose alcohol harm the human body? And you can see a diagram very much like this if you just Google alcohol associated organ damage. You can see on the diagram that there's almost no organ system that is unaffected by drinking. And again, the more that a person drinks, the more of an effect there will be. So, and somebody could be a heavy, frequent drinker, not develop all the diagnostic features to be called alcohol use disorder, and over time still do significant damage to their organs. So these are all the organs, and down here are the cancers, and we'll talk more about those in subsequent slides. And then we now are aware that many scientists are saying that lifespan is inversely correlated with alcohol consumption. Another way to say that would be that lifespan is correlated with lower alcohol consumption. So here's the liver. And early signs of liver problems will be picked up in your annual physical, typically by abnormal liver function tests, and may lead your primary care physician to ask you about your drinking. Alcohol is not the only cause of liver disease, but it's probably the most common one. So there are 3 stages of liver disease. The first one is fatty liver, more fat deposits in the liver. The second one is hepatitis, which is inflammation of the liver. And there are other kinds of hepatitis. We're talking here about alcoholic hepatitis. And those are fatty liver and hepatitis are reversible or treatable. Cirrhosis is irreversible and happens typically after a number of years of heavy drinking. So this is not, this doesn't fit under the title I had of even light drinking. But it is severe scarring that you can see in the illustration, and it is not reversible. So aside from liver function tests, generally people don't have symptoms and are not aware of anything painful until the damage is severe in their liver. There is some evidence that even small amounts, but over a period of a number of years, can lead to some damage. 90% of people who have 4 drinks a day or more have signs of fatty liver. And of those who die from liver disease, and as we noted, alcohol is not the only cause, 48% are from liver disease involving alcohol. Cancer. So this is a new thing. It came up, I think, in a Surgeon General's report recently, and there's been more publicity about it, but it's not a brand new finding. So a number of kinds of cancer are associated with drinking, and some of them with even light drinking. So you have liver. So in addition to the liver diseases we just talked about, there's liver cancer, and there's also colon and colorectal cancer. is associated with heavy drinking. Even light drinking over time is associated with these other kinds of cancer, mouth and throat cancer and larynx. And that's the alcohol is hitting those areas regularly, as well as the esophagus. And you see esophageal cancer. um, this is a little personal aside, but we had a neighbor down our block. We often referred to as the mayor of our block. He was always walking his dog. He was very friendly. Everybody knew him. He knew what was happening with everybody. And every day, and he never seemed grossly intoxicated, but there was almost always beer on his breath as he said hello. Um, and he, in his 60s, his late 60s, died last year of mouth, throat, and larynx cancer. And that is very likely because he was a daily drinker, even though probably not in very high amounts. For breast cancer, the mechanism is more indirect and involves something about hormones and inflammation. I'm not a biologist and I can't explain that in detail. So these cancers increase with the amount consumed, and also if someone is also a smoker, that greatly increases the likelihood of developing these cancers. Cognitive and brain-related problems. So over the short term, what we see in people who drink frequently or beyond very light is slowed cognitive function. So they don't think quite as fast. The wheels don't turn quite as fast. We see reduced concentration and impaired memory and reasoning. So that apparently, we're not talking about just while they're under the influence. That apparently has been measured even in people who don't drink heavily. The long-term kinds of brain damage are most clearly associated with heavy drinking, and this includes brain damage and atrophy of parts of the brain that can be seen on MRIs, for example. Also reported associated with heavy drinking is increased risk of stroke, increased risk of dementia. And there's also something called Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome that is not as prevalent as it once was. It's associated with drinking quite heavily over a number of years, but it's irreversible and it looks something like dementia. I remember years ago when I used to do a little bit of psychological testing, and I tested a very amiable fellow who had this syndrome. And we did a few hours of testing in the morning and then took an hour off for lunch. And when he came back to continue the testing in the afternoon, he didn't remember having met me in the morning. Alcohol can affect sleep. It interferes with REM sleep and leads to poor sleep quality. Often, many people will say, I drink because that allows me to fall asleep. That is true. But then they're much more likely to awaken in the middle of the night as the alcohol leaves their system. What happens is when you're sending alcohol and nervous system depressant into your nervous system, and then it's being metabolized and leaving, and your nervous system is always trying to maintain homeostasis. So it's pushing back and you end up a little more stimulated than you were before you put the depressant into it. So people develop insomnia and poor quality sleep. And if you don't get enough sleep, of course, you're more lethargic during the day. The other thing is that drinking before bed increases sleep apnea. I assume that this is because your throat muscles are either even further relaxed so that there's more obstruction. Well, what can alcohol do to your heart? Um, Over time, drinking can increase blood pressure. It can affect heart rhythm, and it can weaken heart muscles. So all muscles are subject to the effect of drinking over time, more so the more a person drinks. And these features have been um, documented mainly in studies of heavy drinkers. Now, one thing I should say is that most of the studies ever done are on heavy drinkers. So we're only beginning to find out more about the effects of relatively lighter drinking. But if your heart muscles are weak, then you're not pumping blood efficiently through your body. So that becomes a problem. Suicide, something we might not typically think of as an effect of drinking, but it has been studied, and it makes sense when you think about it. So I think, well, there would be two mechanisms that might lead to suicide related to drinking. So one would be that over time, we know that for many people, depression gets worse if they're drinking significantly. Even though they feel relieved when they first take the drink. The other aspect of this, I think, is the acute effects of being under the influence. So for light drinkers, the odds ratio of suicide is 2.7, meaning you have almost 3 times the chance of dying by suicide if you're drinking even a bit. For people who are drinking heavily uh, or who have a blood alcohol concentration of more than 0.10, and for some reference, the point where if you were stopped for driving, you would fail the breathalyzer would be 0.08. Then the ratio is 37. I mean, you're 37 more times to die by suicide. I think that this includes, I don't know this for sure, but I think that this includes people who drank in order to reduce their second thoughts and inhibitions and follow through on a suicide that they may have already intended. But we certainly know that alcohol is a disinhibitor. And so that feels rewarding to people maybe when they're socializing because they're not as self-conscious, for example. And maybe if you want to go bungee cord jumping, you'll feel less fearful and maybe you'll be glad you did it. And you might, I don't think it's a good idea, but I'm sure people sometimes use alcohol to shut off the part of their brain that has rational fear. Personally, the bungee cord jumping is the last thing I would ever consider. But that's what it does. It anesthetizes the outer layers of the brain where second thoughts would occur. Alcohol, of course, is also associated with other violence, including homicide and domestic violence. And interestingly, not only for the perpetrator, but for the victim. We certainly do not want to blame victims for anything that happens to them. But since there's data suggesting that people who are victimized are also more likely to be drinking, we might surmise that they're not having enough cautious second thoughts, or figuring out ways to get out of the situation before it harms them. That is my speculation. So there are other medical issues that are related to drinking. One of them is gastritis and GERD, which is reflux, gastroesophageal reflux. These are both very common. Anyone who has reflux, I think, has learned from experience that alcohol consumption will trigger it or make it worse. Pancreatitis is also associated with drinking. Heavy drinking. These are mostly heavy drinking ones. Weakened immune system and susceptibility to pneumonia. Sorry, forgot to shut off my phone. That is a song by Harry Nilsson that I have on my phone for when my daughter calls. Back to the slides. Dehydration is associated with heavy drinking, and muscle loss. We mentioned muscles before in connection with heart muscles, but it can affect all muscles. So in 2018, and this got my attention back then, The Lancet, which is a medical journal in Britain that's equivalent to the Journal of the American Medical Association here, did the largest meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is where they pull together lots and lots of studies done all over the place. They eliminate many of them for poor methodology, and they sort of combine the findings from those that are left. And they reached a couple of conclusions. Alcohol use is a leading risk factor for disease burden worldwide, and that their results show that the safest level of drinking is none. So this is, when people are thinking, isn't it wonderful that we're drinking? Isn't it cool that I have this great kind of scotch or this exotic kind of wine? They are not thinking about the fact that alcohol is a drug and that it has an effect, and that in fact, if you want to be as cautious as possible, you would choose not to drink. Of course, everybody's going to be weighing that against what benefits they feel they get from drinking. And I think most people are not going to decide, if they don't have to stop drinking altogether. But I think a lot of wise people will adjust their drinking downward as we become more and more aware of these issues. And then it's going to be a particular challenge in the world of lawyers. Now, what are some things that a person can do instead of drinking? Well, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I'm sure you've all been going to talks about wellness, and LCL does a lot of them. And but among the things that a person could do when they want to switch gears, relax, feel more comfortable, say I'm outside of my workday, I want to feel less anxious, I want to feel more serene. Among the options are meditation. We know that definitely reduces anxiety and tension and actually improves cognitive efficiency. Exercise and sports. We know that exercise improves mood and as well as cardiac function, etc. Talking to other people, is very good for people, and you end up feeling better, and it has generally no adverse consequences. And lawyers tend not to do enough of it. Lawyers tend to be acculturated to keep everything close to the vest and only uh, express themselves as necessary. And they're very concerned with privilege and confidentiality and tend not to talk about, in many cases, what stressful experiences they've been having, even though there usually are definitely ways to talk about these things without compromising anyone's case or privacy. Um, Psychologists, by the way, talk too much. And so I've noticed when I have to be in a deposition or something like that, that I could give a one-word answer and instead I give a paragraph. So that's a problem from the other side. But as a psychologist, I recommend that lawyers communicate more. Music, I think, is an underutilized resource for shifting mood and feeling better. Uh, Playing it is nice if you can do that, but listening to it in an immersive way, I think, is very effective. And you may have to choose the kind of music that gets you the desired effect. Humor, making jokes, watching comedy shows on Netflix, etc., um, helps change mood and induce relaxation. Getting enough sleep, and sleep at times can be escapist, and it's certainly, if you're in need of escapism, is healthier than drinking, unless you're developing major depression, and in some cases, sleeping too much becomes a symptom of that. More often, it's insomnia, but some people develop hypersomnia. And finally, being part of a community and shifting into a spiritual perspective are both helpful to people's mental health and achieve some of what they might be looking for in a quick way by drinking. Of course, you'll find that, for example, in church groups, etc. So I think we're getting near the end of the slides. I was afraid they'd take up too much time, but they have not. These are things to ponder. I don't have necessarily the answers on these. They're for you to ponder and maybe volunteer some thoughts. What are some ways to denormalize drinking in settings that lawyers inhabit, in a world that has tended to smile upon a fair amount of drinking in a number of circumstances? Another question is, if you're going to abstain at times or drink very little, assuming you have the option, do you anticipate needing to explain to others why you're not drinking? And this also applies to those who don't have a choice, who really need to abstain for their own safety. And do you find yourself, does this come up for you? It seems to come up for some people in some settings and not for others, where people are saying, why are you not drinking? Or, come on, you can do it this time, and join me for a drink. And so another question would be, in the absence of alcohol use disorder, meaning what we used to say is, if you don't have alcoholism, how would you weigh, for you, the benefits and risks of drinking? Somebody said to me recently, when I was talking to them about the inverse correlation between longevity and drinking, they said, I'm willing to lose a couple of years in order to enjoy what I experience as the benefits. And I suppose there are people who would say that about smoking as well. Oh, so apparently that is the end of my presentation. I'm always glad to find that out. So now we have some time for discussion.
So first of all, Jeff, thank you so much. This was really interesting. Again, understanding it's not just the heavy drinking that has an impact on our bodies, that it is short term. And one of the things that occurred to me, especially with lawyers, that having a drink maybe the night before a big trial or a big transactional deal, commercial real estate deal, where you need to be able to really attend to it, that it does have a real short-term effect. If it affects your sleeping, as people I'm sure have listened to Dr. Sean Healy's presentations on sleep, that even one night of not sleeping well affects you the next day. And so again, having alcohol impact that sleep. And again, the short-term cognitive functioning, where if you're a lawyer, that is the most important, your brain is the most important tool. So thank you again. We do have some questions, and actually we have two different questions, but essentially asking the same thing. People are curious if you can define again heavy drinking versus light drinking.
Oh, well, so that is, and that comes up in these studies too. And one interesting thing about it, I'll say preliminarily, is that these definitions are largely cultural, so that studies done in different countries have different ways of defining light and heavy drinking. In addition, in our own society, the definitions have changed. When I did my dissertation study, which was an alcohol treatment study, and we followed people up for a year, and we coded their drinking every day for abstinent, I guess we called it moderate or heavy. At that time, the cutoff was 6 standard drinks. So to call it heavy drinking was more than 6 standard drinks. Nowadays, it's much lower than that. So the American, I think it's maybe the FDA or somebody has determined what to call heavy drinking, and it is for men more than 2 standard drinks a day, and for women more than 1 standard drink a day, because women do absorb and metabolize alcohol at a different rate than men. What is a standard drink, you may ask, or you may know. So a standard drink is about one 12-ounce beer, and beer, especially for men, is the most common drink, even among very definitely among people with alcohol use disorder, as well as everybody else. And it's equivalent also to a 4 to 5 ounce glass of wine. And a lot of people pour larger glasses than that. And or 1 shot of liquor. And that, even the definition of a shot varies. But it's something like an ounce and a quarter to an ounce and a half. So all of those have about the same amount of absolute alcohol in them, of pure alcohol. And so yes, what's currently being called light drinking is 1 or less a day for women and 2 or less a day for men. In the NORC study and others that use a measure called the audit C, that only looks at amount and frequency and not at consequences. It was possible, and I thought this inflated the findings. It was possible for women who had something like only 3 drinks in a week to be considered drinking hazardously, depending on how it worked out. So, but those are the current definitions, and they may change again. And again, in some other countries, how they define light drinking is different.
Mm. Excellent. Thank you for that. I think there were a lot of questions out there regarding that. The next question is, and this is a very interesting one, do you believe that there is any correlation between incivility in the law and drinking?
Wow. I think I may be less qualified to answer this question than the people who are listening, who are lawyers. Um, but it certainly is. I mean, I can't really say. It certainly is possible. Um, I uh, I imagine that in some interactions, people are actually under the influence, but probably not usually. But people who are drinking frequently, who are in some kind of state of mild withdrawal, are often more irritable. And so it seems possible that there's some relationship between the two. I'm very interested in and disturbed by the frequency of incivility among lawyers. I don't know that alcohol is going to turn out to be the big one. I will also say it's a well-known feature of people with alcohol use disorder, those that we over the years have called alcoholic, that people develop defense mechanisms to justify their addictive behavior. And one of them is called externalization, which is blaming others more. Like, I'm okay, it's you, you're the problem. So that might, in some cases, turn into incivility. But I have a feeling we'd have a big problem with incivility even if nobody drank.
That was very helpful. And it just reminded me again, if we're talking about sleep, for some people like me, sometimes if I don't get a good night's sleep, I can be a little bit more irritable the next day. So again, I think there are a number of different factors. Another question is, we've often heard of studies regarding red wine being beneficial. Hearing what you were talking about today, um, gives somebody maybe a little pause. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I have many thoughts on it, and they began years ago when those studies started to come out. Um, and I don't really know who funded those studies, but I have a feeling it was people with an interest in red wine. But uh, so there were some findings that exclusively in terms of heart disease, that people who had uh, relatively few drinks per occasion, but drank red wine, um, would live longer in terms of heart disease. That would be less likely to get it, or it would happen later. So even at the time, it seemed like, well, maybe that's the case, but uh, maybe that's a third variable kind of issue where people who have one or two glasses of red wine are also people in a certain socioeconomic bracket, or maybe they're also people who eat in a certain way, etc. Maybe it wasn't the wine. Um,
Mm.
and and then the other thing that we realized even then, that some of us realized, is yeah, but what about all the other diseases? So, because that was only looking at your longevity with regard to heart disease. And then when people started to do studies of longevity in general, including all the other parts of the body, it still turned out that drinking was worse for you. But I do
Mm.
remember a time where I was thinking, I was feeling guilty. I wasn't having red wine. Oh, maybe I should be having this. That would be the healthy thing to do. But no, it wasn't true. And then subsequently, people have reanalyzed those studies and found them to be poor in design.
Mm.
They probably were not correct in the first place. So the upshot is, I think we can forget about that concept. But it was certainly good for the red wine industry while it lasted.
Very helpful to know. One of the things that struck me, There are many people out there on various medications, whether it's for depression or for a whole bunch of other reasons. Again, drinking even one alcoholic drink, I'm wondering, again, somebody might not feel the impact immediately, or some may. Any comments or thoughts on drinking while you're on medication?
Yes, you have to be careful. So, there was one kind of antidepressant that is rarely used anymore, where it was actually dangerous to have a fermented product on it. Those were called MAO inhibitors. You also had to avoid cheese and a number of other things, and they uh, are not used very often anymore. Um, but for the other antidepressants, and most of them are SSRI antidepressants, um, the downside of drinking is that it will counteract the effect of the medication. So that not that something dangerous will happen, but that the meds won't work as well. So if you have major depression and you're drinking a fair amount and you're taking Lexapro, let's say, the Lexapro may not do much for you. And if you weren't drinking, it might do more for you. So there's that. Yeah, there might be one other thing to say, but I can't remember what it was. But oh yeah, the other thing is, of course, when it comes to benzodiazepines, and also antihistamines. So if you a benzodiazepine would be a tranquilizer. The most commonly used one these days is Ativan, also known as lorazepam, or it might be Klonopin. When you add alcohol to those, it potentiates their effect. It's like it multiplies the effect. So you are going to be much more drugged than you're meant to be. And it becomes dangerous to drive, for example, even if you had only one or two drinks, which might not get you up to a 0.08 blood alcohol level, but you also are taking tranquilizers, you're impaired. And the other thing is that it also applies to antihistamines like Benadryl, chlorotrimazole, etc. So you have to be careful on those.
So just a quick question as follow-up. So if somebody maybe had one or two drinks with dinner and then later on they wanted to go to sleep and they used lorazepam or something else or an antihistamine, sometimes people might take a Benadryl. So even then, does it have an impact if maybe it was an hour or two before, you're not taking it at the same time together? Does that make a difference?
Yeah, that does make a difference. The
Yeah.
less alcohol that's in your bloodstream, the less chance there is going to be of this amplification of the effect.
Yeah.
So if you had one drink at 7 p.m. and then you're going to bed at 10 or something, that's probably not an issue. I,
Okay.
that's my understanding. I should mention that I'm a PhD, not an MD, and I don't play an MD on TV either.
All right. So thank you again, Jeff. I see that we are just out of time, but again, really helpful, insightful. And I want to remind people that we do have a feedback form that will be sent to you. If you could fill that out, we're always looking to improve our programming, and also you will be receiving a recording of this, and so you can rewatch it if you want, share it with somebody, and then we'll also have it in our digital library for further viewing. So thank you again, Jeff, and we appreciate everybody who joined us today, and stay tuned for our programming next month. Dr. Tracy Myers and Stacy Best will be talking about the polyvagal theory and ethics. Thank you again. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.